Did you ask Secretary Hegseth to walk back his comments yesterday saying Ukraine won't join NATO and won't go back to pre-2014 borders because those are bargaining chips you could use?
No, I didn't. Somebody told me to, but I thought his comments were good yesterday, and they're probably good today. They're a little bit softer, perhaps, but I thought his comments yesterday were pretty accurate. I don't see any way that a country in Russia's position could allow them, just in their position, could allow them to join NATO. I don't see that happening. And long before President Putin, Russia was very strong on the fact that I believe that's the reason the war started, because Biden went out and said that they could join NATO, and he shouldn't have said that. As soon as he said that, I said, you know what? You're going to have a war now, and I was right about that.
And Nick, I mean, you've spent so much time covering the war in Ukraine at the front lines. You just heard President Trump again was asked this afternoon with Prime Minister Modi about what Russia should give up in the negotiations, again, to seem to blame the war on Ukraine's goal of joining NATO, which is a line Russia has been using. How much daylight is there between President Trump's position and the Kremlin's position on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's eerily familiar, it seems, how much of this conversation you'd imagine with the Kremlin head. We're not privy to what's said between them, but how much that he appears to reiterate in public. Just to recap here, Russia invaded Ukraine. It appears to have been a strategic decision about trying to ensure the country in its orbit stayed very much so. Ukraine's had ambitions to get closer to the European Union and in the farthest future possibly join NATO, but it's a very long, unrealistic path. That wasn't the reason why the war started. And so, yeah, we're seeing increasingly things that the Kremlin would like to have become part of US policy being spoken by Trump. He appears to be a bit fuzzy on the details of NATO membership. That is something certainly that Zelensky has reached for recently as a bid to try and get some sort of security guarantees if there was a future ceasefire. And the fascinating thing about Hegseth's comments is that the idea that Ukraine can't join NATO or get its 2014 borders back is a reality. It's one accepted by the European allies of Ukraine, but it was one that they were never going to lay out in public because essentially the bluff of it was part of a negotiating strategy. In the same day that Hegseth called Trump the best negotiator in the world, he basically showed their hand entirely. And it leaves me wondering whether this actually may have been more by design. It may be about Washington making sure that publicly they're stating things Putin wants to hear as part of a process that we may not be privy to at this stage, Anderson.
Kremlin-controlled TV jovial, even the anchor surprised by the concessions President Donald Trump offered Russian President Vladimir Putin in their 90-minute phone conversation. An extensive talk about ending the war in Ukraine while seemingly sidelining Ukraine's leader. Not a word about Zelensky, the host says, or rather, if there were words, they were only negative ones. Ukraine will not get back its territories. Ukraine will not join NATO.
And I think they have to make peace. That's what I think.
Moscow more than willing to take up President Trump's offer for immediate peace talks to end the three-year war. Russia saying it's already starting preparations for possible direct meetings between the U.S. president and the Russian leader. The first time in 4 years the leaders of the U.S. and Russia would meet face-to-face. The current administration, as far as we understand, holds the view that everything must be done to stop the war and for peace to prevail. The Kremlin's press secretary says, "We are much more impressed by the position of the current administration, and we're open to dialogue." Dialogue apparently without Kiev at the table, Ukraine's president growing increasingly frustrated and concerned. It's important that everything does not go according to Putin's plan, Zelensky says. He wants to do everything to make his negotiations bilateral. But many Ukrainians fear that's exactly what's happening, feeling President Trump is selling them out.
President Putin wants to have peace now, and that's good. And he didn't want to have peace with Biden. And you tell me why that is, okay?
Trump's plan is to rob Ukraine as much as possible, this woman in Kiev says, not to make peace here. It looks like Ukraine is being betrayed, this woman says. In what is being said now, I do not see anything good for Ukraine. It's very sad. Ukraine's army is steadily losing ground to the Russians, mostly due to manpower and weapons shortages. Russian forces already occupy more than 20% of the country, territory the new U.S. Defense Secretary bluntly says Kiev most probably won't get back, much to the dismay of America's close NATO partners and the Ukrainians.
There is no betrayal there. There is a recognition that the whole world and the United States is invested and interested in peace.
America's allies in shock, Moscow pleased. Russia's foreign minister praising President Trump when I asked him at a press conference.
Are you more hopeful now that there can be real and fundamental change and improvement in U.S.-Russian relations?
This is how you should communicate with Russia, he says. Perhaps that is why many in the West, including the leaders of the European Union, were shocked when a simple, normal conversation took place between two polite, educated individuals. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Moscow.
We are getting some conflicting messaging out of the administration over the past few days. Vice President Vance giving an interview to the Wall Street Journal in which he appears to be taking a tougher line on Russia and what it would take to get them to the table to negotiate a peace deal in Ukraine, saying that there are economic tools of leverage that can be used against Russia, and there are also military tools of leverage that can be used against Russia. Now, whether that means U.S. troops going into Ukraine, that is a major question that we're going to be listening out for, because you remember just a couple of days ago, the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said quite bluntly there will be no U.S. troops going into Ukraine, that there would not be U.S. involvement when it comes to security guarantees for Ukraine. That's a big thing that the Europeans and Ukrainians wanted to see the U.S. be a part of. And he also said that in an eventual deal, that Ukraine would not be a member of NATO. But now we have the vice president saying still everything is on the table for these negotiations. I want to play a little bit of what the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had to say earlier today as he tried to clarify these varying positions.
My job today and in Brussels was to introduce realism to the conversation. The reality that returning to 2014 as borders as part of a negotiated settlement is unlikely. The reality of U.S. troops in Ukraine is unlikely. The reality of Ukraine membership in NATO as a part of a negotiated settlement, unlikely. And I stand by the comments that I made.
Kate, I think many would say that the reality is far from clear at this point, but of course that's what negotiations are for. But there are many wondering why the U.S. appears to be giving Russia concessions before these negotiations even begin, most notably saying that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO, and Trump just saying yesterday that Russia should be allowed to once again join the G8, which they were kicked out of back in 2014 after invading Ukraine the first time.
As far as Vladimir Putin being emboldened, he's going to declare victory no matter what. You can expect that no matter what the outcome is. Thankfully, the bravery of the Ukrainians and allies that came alongside them, especially early in the war, deterred and defeated Vladimir Putin from achieving what he wanted, which was all of Ukraine.